The squawk hit the knuckleboom's working channel at the worst possible minute of the day, which was shift change, and it was still repeating when Tugmaster Renata Okoye blew the dock clamps and swung the tug's blunt nose off Meridian Yard without waiting for clearance. 11 words of machine distress looped in Irvit trade code on a band that belonged to a human towing outfit and nobody else. Across the system, on a polished floor in the corridor office, an Irvit lane director was already telling his staff there was no emergency. The tug was already moving. Nia Varga heard the squawk from halfway down the ladder between the engine room and the galley, one boot still hooked on a rung, a thermos of yesterday's tea in her teeth. The channel speaker by the ladder head was a cheap one, blown at the low end, and it made the loop sound like a man clearing his throat between every word. She knew every voice that had any business on Band 6, Callaway Dispatch, the yard crane operators, the fuel barge with its bored pilot, who hummed when he thought his mic was cold. This was none of them. This was a flat dead, synthetic cadence reading out numbers, and the numbers were wrong in a way that made her stop chewing the thermos lid. Mass, 2,060,000 tons. Thrust state, positive locked 100%. Guidance unresponsive, helm unresponsive, collision class, raised. Then a position and a vector, and then the loop again, patient as a dripping pipe. She was 25 years old, and she had spent 7 of those years inside engine rooms, and she had never once heard a hauler admit it was going to hit something. Haulers didn't talk to people. Haulers talked to the corridor office in encrypted bursts, on bands so far from human allocation you'd need a different radio to even brush them. The big automated ore drones ran the Osabelt route on rails of math, 20 days out, 20 days back, no crew, no windows, no mercy on the schedule. You worked around them the way you worked around weather. By the time she reached the wheelhouse, the dock was already sliding off the port screens, and Okoye had the intercom open to the whole boat. All hands secure for burn. This is not a drill and it is not a clerical error, so save the questions. Varga, I need the plant at full readiness 10 minutes ago. Reyes, plot me a closing course on that vector. Brun SO, rig the deck for heavy work and then strap in. Nia keyed the nearest panel instead of running aft, because there was a question that couldn't wait. Master, whose squawk is that? There's nothing of ours out there that masses 2 million tons. It's the deep furrow. Okoye said the name the way you'd report a house fire on your own street. Muro Combine drone, Vunt class, fully loaded out of the Osa catch. Her control core's gone and her drive is stuck wide open. And she's telling everyone she can still reach, which appears to be us. A pause, and the deck shivered as the mains lit. Corridor office says their telemetry reads nominal and we should mind our band discipline. So we'll mind it all the way out to the intercept. That was the whole briefing. That was all the briefing there was ever going to be, because nobody briefs a tug crew. Nia had understood that since her first month on the boat. The freight lines got route intelligence and threat assessments and quarterly safety circulars with their logos on the cover. The corridor office got a tower full of analysts with cooled drinks. The knuckleboom got whatever fell on Band 6, and the standing instruction that came with every Callaway contract. If it's loose in your corridor, it's yours until someone better shows up. Nobody better was showing up. She felt that in her stomach before she could have proved it on paper, the same way she could feel a bearing going bad 2 decks away through the soles of her boots. The engine room received her the way it always did, with heat and the smell of resin and 100 small sounds layered into one big one. The knuckleboom orbital heavy tug, 40 years old, built ugly on purpose. A thick spine of trusswork with a drive cluster like a fist of bottles at the stern, crew spaces bolted on top, and the towing gear, the winches, the yard arms, the grapnel cradles, hung along her flanks like tools on a pegboard. She could shove around anything that floated in the corridor, given time. Time was the part Nia already didn't like. She brought the reactor up through its stages with both hands and one ear on the channel. The squawk kept looping. Position, vector, mass, the flat confession of a machine that knew exactly what was wrong with itself and could do nothing about any of it. Guidance unresponsive, helm unresponsive. There was something obscene about the patience of it. A creature would have screamed. The deep furrow just kept reading her own death certificate aloud at 15-second intervals to a band full of plumbers. Daz Reyes's voice came down from the wheelhouse, stretched thin over the rising burn. Numbers, people, because you're going to hear them anyway. She went runaway 51 minutes ago, give or take. She's pulling a third of a G and she will not stop pulling it because the thing that could order the drive to shut down is a kilo of slag in a casing. Current speed 31 and change kilometers per second, climbing every second we talk about it. Headed where? That was Hask from the deck airlock, already in his rigging harness. Haskell Brun was 61 years old, had hands like dock fenders, and asked questions in the order a working man asks them. Not what happened, But where is it going and what do we have to do about it? Right now, nowhere. Her lane takes her 80,000 kilometers clear of anything that breathes. If absolutely nothing else goes wrong, she burns through her propellant in a couple of days, goes ballistic, and the Combine's insurers spend a year catching their property. Daz let one breath of silence sit on the line. But her veins took damage when the core cooked. She's bending. Slow, but she's bending sunward, and sunward of her lane is the Sasuna shell. Nia's hands didn't stop moving over the board, because they never stopped moving when the numbers got ugly. That was the trade. But she felt the word arrive in the compartment like a cold draft. Everyone in the system knew what rode the Sasuna shell. The ring was the first thing you saw coming in from the belt, and the last thing you saw heading out. A bright unbroken band of habitat round the waist of the planet, glass and field farms and freight locks, and 11.4 million Ervet who had never once thought about Band 6 in their lives. How long to know if she crosses the shell? Okoye asked, calm, loading the question like cargo. If the bend holds steady, she cuts the shell in a bit under 8 hours. Whether she cuts it where the ring is, ask me in 2. It's a big shell, Master. It's a small ring. Daz didn't sound like he believed his own comfort, and the math didn't either. A third of a G, applied for 8 hours by something that massive, had a way of finding the one thing in the corridor you loved. The corridor office came back on the band at the top of the hour, and this time it wasn't a clerk. The voice introduced itself as Lane Director Hesh Vorlin, and it had that grain-fed steadiness that Nia had learned to associate with people whose chairs did not move. The translation collar gave him a baritone and an accent like a closing door. Calloway tugged Knuckleboom, you are burning without clearance on a commercial corridor. Be advised that Combine hull telemetry for the vessel you reference reads nominal in all categories: drive nominal, guidance nominal, lane adherence nominal. Whatever you are receiving is a malfunctioning maintenance transmitter, and salvage opportunism on a live corridor is a confiscable offense. Return to Meridian Yard. Okoye let the loop answer him. She put the squawk on the open band, all 11 words of it twice. Mass, thrust lock, guidance unresponsive, collision class raised. Your nominal is a recording, she said. The core froze its last good snapshot when it cooked, and it's been mailing you that snapshot ever since. The hull is talking on the only transmitter the fire didn't reach, and the only reason it's talking to me is that your grandfathers leased the cheap end of the spectrum to humans and your channel map never got the memo. Check your snapshot timestamps, Director. I'll wait. She would not, in fact, wait, and the deck's steady half-G of burn said so. Nia grinned at the fuel flow gauges without meaning to. Around her, the plant climbed through its red lines one click at a time, all of them hers to watch, and the tug put her shoulder down and ran. It would be 3 more hours before anyone in the corridor office checked a timestamp. 3 hours is nothing. It is a long lunch, a committee recess, the time it takes to draft a carefully worded denial. On the working end of a corridor, 3 hours is 250,000 kilometers of closing distance and every option you will ever have, spending itself while somebody upstream clears their throat. 2 decks above, in the wheelhouse, Timo Esso had the watch on the tracking board, 19 years old, and visibly aware that this was the first afternoon of his life that mattered. He'd come aboard as Calloway's apprentice 3 months back, all elbows and apology. Now he steadied his voice and read the plot like Hask had taught him, oldest habit in the towing trade. Say what the screen says, not what you hope it says. Return's getting big, he reported. Master the return's the size of a moonlet. That can't be right. It's right, Okoye said. 2 million tons makes a proud blip. Keep reading. Drive plumes visible on the long lens, naked eye visible, I mean. Like a star with a tail. He swallowed. It's pretty. It's 200 meters of fire coming out of a machine nobody's flying, Hask said over the deck circuit, not unkindly. Admire it on your own time. Nia listened to them while she walked her gauges, and the engine room walls felt close and familiar and suddenly very thin. Pretty was the right word and the wrong one. She'd seen the Vun-class hulls at distance her whole career, monsters of the catch run. 1.5 kilometers of ore holds strung on a spine, drive cluster aft like a cathedral of nozzles, no portholes, no lights except the lane strobes because nothing aboard had eyes. The Combine ran 9 of them and called them the most reliable tonnage in the system, and that was true right up until the afternoon one of them cooked its brain and became the most reliable catastrophe instead. The squawk looped. 15 seconds. She found she'd started bracing against it the way you brace for a leaking valve to spit. Varga. Okoye's voice. On the private circuit this time, just the 2 of them. Plant status honest version. Mains are sweet. I can hold this burn for 9 hours before I start lying to you. Nia checked the propellant mass against the plot one more time, because hope is not a number. Master honest version of something else too. If Daz's intercept needs more than one hard correction, We get one shot at coming alongside and no propellant to come home on. Someone will have to fetch us. Someone fetching us is a problem I'd love to have. A breath on the line, the sound of a woman calculating in a currency she'd spent her whole life in. I towed grain barges with your chief's chief. You know that? 30 years on this corridor. The office never once briefed us on anything. Not a solar storm, not a pirate season, not so much as a pressure advisory. Every piece of weather we ever wrote out, we heard it first on the working band from somebody just as unbriefed as us. A click, like she'd started to say something else and put it back. They're going to deny this thing until it's unfixable, Nia. That's not malice. It's posture. People whose chairs don't move think nothing else does either. And we move. It's the whole job description, Okoye said. Go feed my engines. The first hour of a stern chase is bookkeeping, and the bookkeeping was brutal in its plainness. The deep furrow did not maneuver, did not coast, did not do any of the things a quarry does in stories. She just accelerated, dumb and total, adding 13 meters per second to her speed with every breath Nia took, and the geometry of catching her got worse, with every one of those breaths in a way you could write on a napkin. The knuckle boom was faster, empty tugs are all engine, but speed wasn't the problem. The problem was the matching. To board a ship under thrust, you don't just reach her. You have to lay alongside her and burn at her exact acceleration, G for G, while your winch crew works, and the tug only carried so many minutes of that kind of flying. Daz called the window at 68 minutes. That's the commit line. We burn past that line, we're catching her or we're nothing. After that, physics stops selling tickets. Buy the ticket? Okoye said. The corridor office called twice more before the line. The first call threatened Calloway's operating license, citing Lane statute in long Irvit paragraphs that the caller translated into beautiful, useless English. The second call was different. The second call was a new voice, younger, lower in the room somehow, like someone leaning over a console with a hand cupped round the pickup, and it didn't open with a statute. Tug knuckle boom. Verify your receipt of the deep furrows maintenance, squawk at marker 221. A pause that had breathing in it. Verify the thrust state field specifically. Okoye's tone shifted by 1 degree, dock boss to dock boss. Receipted and logged, thrust state positive and locked, 100%, 51 minutes stale at first receipt. Who am I talking to? Lane Warden Ulith Kavi, junior grade corridor office traffic floor. A beat. Timestamps on our nominal feed are frozen at the burnout mark. The director's office disputes the interpretation of the word frozen. Another beat, the careful flatness of someone walking past their own chain of command on a high wire. I have access to the optical track. I am routing it to your working band until somebody notices and stops me. The vector you're chasing is 19 seconds out of date. Don't trust it. Mine is live. The tracking screen's repainted in the wheelhouse, and Timo made a sound like he'd been handed a better telescope. The hauler's track came up sharp, real current, and bending, just like Daz had said, a long iron curve with its far end reaching for the bright band of the ring. Warden, Okoye said, you just became my favorite person in your government. I am not in my government, Kavi said. I am on its floor. And the channel clicked off before anyone could thank her properly, which Nia would learn, in the hours ahead, was simply how the warden ended every transmission, as if gratitude were one more thing there wasn't time for. They crossed the commit line at full burn, 68 minutes after the first squawk, and nobody marked it out loud. There was nothing to say. After the line lay Meridian Yard and the fuel barge and the board crane operators and everything sane. Ahead lay a moonlet-sized radar return with a star's tail, getting 480 kilometers an hour faster every hour, reading its own obituary every 15 seconds to the only 5 people in the system who had decided to do something about it. Nia wedged herself into the engineer's saddle between the gauge banks, pulled her harness tight, and watched her plant run hotter than the manual allowed, which was a sentence that described most of her adult life. The thermos of yesterday's tea was still in her jacket. She drank it cold during the long burn, because shift change had been 3 hours ago, because nobody had eaten, because the working day had simply forgotten to end. On the band, between squawks, she could hear the corridor's ordinary traffic carrying on far behind them. A grain barge requesting clearance, a crane operator complaining about his elbow, the small dull weather of working lives. Ahead of them, the deep furrow's plume had grown from a star to a torch. The wrong channel had done its work. The wrong species was on its way. The corridor office issued its first public statement around then. Timo read it off the bulletin feed, and his voice cracked exactly once. The statement said that reports of a guidance anomaly on a combine ore drone were unverified, that corridor users should observe normal operations, and that an unauthorized human vessel maneuvering near the freight lane had been instructed to return to port. Are we the unauthorized human vessel? Timo asked. We're the normal operations, Hask said. File it and forget it, boy. Paper catches up later. It always does. Right now, the only document that matters is that track. The track said 7 hours, 11 minutes to the Sasuna shell. The track said the bend was holding. The track said that somewhere in the next few hours, the corridor's owners would start doing things to their runaway, official things, decisive things, and every soul on the knuckle boom had worked salvage long enough to know the shape of what was coming the way you know weather in your knees. Get some food in you, all of you, Okoye ordered, and then get suits checked. Whatever they try first won't work. She didn't say it bitterly. That was the thing Nia would remember afterward when people asked. The master said it the way you'd say the tide comes in. Whatever they try first won't work, not because the people upstream were stupid, but because they were far away, and the deep furrow had stopped being a faraway problem the moment her brain burned. She was a close-up problem now. She was knuckles and pry bars and hydraulics. She belonged to the trades. The tug ran on through the bright, cold afternoon of the corridor, engine humming at the edge of its life, 5 humans and a thermos of cold tea closing on 2 million tons of fire, and behind them, on a polished floor, the machinery of denial began, slowly, and with perfect confidence, to make everything worse. The traffic floor of the corridor office was a bowl of pale stone and daylight, built by a species that liked to watch its own sky while it worked. Eulith Kavi had loved the room from her first shift. The great holo-table sunk in the floor's center like a reflecting pool, the lanes of the system drawn across it in threads of light, the murmur of 40 wardens keeping the threads from tangling. It was a room designed around one premise, that everything in the corridor could be seen, named, and filed. She stood at the pool's rim now and watched the premise die. The Deep Furrow's thread had 2 versions on the table. The official one, fed from Combine telemetry, ran straight and green and serene along the freight lane, a model citizen. The optical one, hers, scraped from the tracking telescopes and patched in under a maintenance flag, because Director Vorlin had not authorized a divergence display, ran, red, and bent. The 2 threads had started the afternoon as one line. Now you could fit a moon between them. The discrepancy is being reviewed, Vorlin said for the 3rd time, to the floor at large. He stood above the pool on the supervisor's walk, robes the gray of office, hands folded. He was not a fool. That was the worst of it. Kavi had seen him untangle lane disputes that had defeated whole committees. But he had been grown in a system where telemetry was truth, where the Combine's drones had run 400 years without a collision, where the procedure for an impossible event was to review it until it became possible, and his calm fell across the floor like a blanket over an alarm bell. Director. Kavi heard her own voice arrive before she'd authorized it. The optical track puts the hull on a sunward bend. If the bend holds, it crosses the Sasuna shell tonight. Review can run in parallel with response. The statutes allow. The statutes allow a junior warden to mind her board. No anger in it. That was the thing about Vorlon. He never spent anger because he never had to. The Combine is initiating a remote command cycle within the hour. The drive will be ordered safe. The hull will be ordered to attitude hold. And tomorrow this will be a maintenance report. The species that built those hulls built them to be told. He believed it, Kavi thought. 40 wardens around the pool believed it, or wanted to, which on a quiet floor is the same thing. And one human tugmaster 300,000 kilometers out on the cheap end of the spectrum believed something else. And Kavi had heard the difference in the woman's voice, the way you hear weight in a load-bearing rope. She kept her board. She kept the optical feed flowing out to Band 6 under its maintenance flag. And when the Combine's remote command cycle began, she watched it happen on the live track with her hands flat on the rim of the pool. In the posture her instructors had called attention to mooring, which was the posture you took when you could not stop what was about to be done. The remote kill arrived at the Deep Furrow as a tight, lawful, beautifully encrypted instruction. Drive safe, attitude hold, await tender. It was received not by the hauler's brain, which was slag, but by the watchdog circuit that had inherited the hull when the brain died. A small, stupid, fireproof thing whose whole legal existence was a single rule written by cautious engineers 400 years ago. The rule said, in degraded mode, reject unverifiable commands. For a command you cannot verify may be piracy. The watchdog could not verify anything. Verification lived in the slag. So it did what its rules said. It rejected the command, logged an intrusion attempt, and slammed shut the one door the fire had left open. The comm transponder went dark. The lane strobes went dark. The navigation beacon, which every telescope in the system had been gratefully ringing on, went dark. 2,060,000 tons stopped answering the universe entirely. And, in the last spasm of its lawful programming, the watchdog commanded the drive gimbals to return to neutral. The gimbals, fire-warped, did not reach neutral. They lurched 2 degrees and seized. On the traffic floor, the Deep Furrow's red thread shivered, dimmed to a dotted projection, and bent harder sunward. The pool went very quiet. Kavi did the new arithmetic in her head before the table could, because she had spent the afternoon doing arithmetic she didn't want, and the answer arrived with a horrible domestic plainness, like a bill. The bend no longer grazed the Sasuna shell. It ended on it. It ended, give or take the width of the error bars, on the bright unbroken band where 11.4 million people were eating their evening meals. Director, she said into the quiet, the command cycle has made it worse. Vorlon was looking at the table. For one moment, she would testify to this later, and be believed, because by then everyone needed it to be true. The office fell out of his face, and something older looked through, something that had also once been young on a floor like this one. Then the office returned. Reacquire the hull, he said, all telescopes, and get me the Spur Squadron. 300,000 kilometers out, the knuckleboom heard the beacon die mid-squawk. The loop cut off between mass and thrust state and did not resume, and the silence where it had been was the loudest thing Nia had ever heard a radio not say. Tell me that's not what it sounds like, Daz said. It's exactly what it sounds like. Okoye's voice could have leveled a floor. They sent a kill command to a hull that can't validate kill commands, and the hull did what scared machinery does. It locked its doors. A breath. Warden Kavi, you still with us on this band? 4 seconds of light lag, there and back, and then the young Irvade voice, flatter than before, the flatness of someone reading their own table and hating it. Confirmed knuckleboom. Transponder dark, beacon dark, strobes dark. Optical tracking only now. And the gimbal moved in the seizure event. The projection, she stopped and the stop had 11 million people in it. The projection intersects the ring. Where? Sector pending. Somewhere on the night arc. Impact in 6 hours, 51 minutes if nothing changes. Paper dry. My office's position is that something will change. The Spur Squadron is being tasked with a physical interdiction. Interceptor drones. The plan is to foul the drive. Hask's voice came up the circuit slowly, like a man rising from under an engine. Foul it with what? Mesh casters. They net debris in the approach lanes. A pause. The squadron's assessment rates the procedure proven. Proven on debris. Debris isn't under thrust. Hask, who in 40 years on dock and deck had watched more proven procedures eat more good equipment than anyone alive, said it without heat. Ma'am Warden, you put a net into a torch plume doing 200 meters of fire, the net's vapor before it touches metal. And if your drone pilots get cute and cast across her bow instead, that hull's pushing through at 30-some clicks a second. She won't even bell. She'll eat the mesh, and the mesh will skin her forward array off, and then you've blinded the one part of her that still knows where the ground is. The light lag pause this time was longer than 4 seconds. I'll forward the assessment, Kavi said, and was gone. Forwarded it was, Nia had no doubt, into whatever pneumatic system carried inconvenient arithmetic upward in that bright stone building, and the result came back down 2 hours later in the only language officials in physics share, which is the language of things actually happening. By then, the chase had changed shape. Daz had spent the propellant ledger like a man emptying his pockets on a counter, one long apogee burn to throw. The tug high over the freight lane, a cold coast across the top of it, and then the dive, using the gravity of Sasuna's outer moon brand to bend them down onto the hauler's wake without paying for the bend in fuel. It was an old bar jockey's trick scaled up to a place where nobody sane flew, and the margins on it had made even Okoye go quiet while she signed off. The knuckleboom fell across the corridor's ceiling with her engines banked, silent, saving every gram, and her crew watched the interdiction on the long lens because there was nothing else they could do. The Spur Squadron flew well. Nia would say that afterward every time to anyone who tried to make the story simpler than it was. 8 interceptor drones in 2 flights, handsome sharp little ships, matched the hauler's track from a stern quarter and laid their mesh with parade precision across the cone where her bow would be. The geometry was textbook. The textbook had been written for dead rock. The deep furrow went through the mesh like a freight train through morning fog. For one instant, the long lens showed a silver bloom wrapping the hauler's bow, lace on an anvil, and then the lace was gone, shredded and smeared down the hull at closing speed, and the hauler's forward sensor mast went with it, sheared at the root, taking the proximity radar and the last functioning navigation eyes the hull owned. Half a heartbeat later, the trailing flight, committed on rails, tried to wave off through the debris of their own success. 2 drones made it. The other 2 were instantly part of the problem, struck and shattered, and added to the smear of junk now riding the hauler's bow wave. And somewhere in that collision, the deep furrow took her wound to the body. A glancing strike low on the forward hull that crushed a vein housing and set the whole vast spine of her very slowly, very faintly, rolling. Tracking, Timo said, hoarse from a dry mouth. She's master, she's precessing now. The thrust axis is wobbling. Plot cone just got fatter. Meaning what, for the unlettered? Hask said, though he knew. He asked for Timo's sake the trade's oldest pedagogy. Make the apprentice say the bad news in his own words so it becomes his. Meaning she's not flying a line anymore, she's drawing circles around one. Meaning we can't predict her hull attitude when we close. And meaning, Timo did the last bit alone, no one filled it in for him. The impact projection's not a point on the ring now, it's an arc. It could come down anywhere along 400 kilometers of it. 400 kilometers of ring is a number. What it is, in fact, is towns. Nia sat in her saddle with her gauges green and steady in front of her and made herself convert the number, because the conversion was the fuel she was going to need before this day ended. Field farms under glass, freight locks, school terraces. The Irvit stacked their habitats along the ring's interface, where the planet hung overhead like a painted ceiling, and they were proud of it, and every single one of those 11 million people had spent today not knowing that their evening had developed a cone of error. Knuckleboom, corridor office. Kavi, and behind her voice now a floor that was no longer murmuring but loud, many voices, the sound of an institution discovering its own pulse. Interdiction assessment, failed, compounded. I'm instructed, a small pause, a sliver of static, and Nia heard in it the exact dimensions of what the young warden was about to spend. I'm instructed to advise all unauthorized vessels to maintain distance from the interdiction zone. Noted, Okoye said. What's your own advice? Lane warden? This pause was not light lag. My advice is that you're 9 minutes from your dive window, Kavi said, and that I've moved my optical feed to a relay your band reaches even in Brand's shadow. There is one working ship in this corridor, and the entire floor I'm standing on knows which one it is. Corridor office out. Okoye keyed the all hands. Outside the wheelhouse glass, the dull amber limb of Brand was rising to meet them, fast and then faster, and beyond it, far down the black, a torch burned at the head of a smear of wreckage, bending toward the brightest thing in the sky. You heard the lady, the master said, dives in 9, boarding stations after. Eat something you can eat with one hand. The dive around Brand was 4 minutes of the moon's cratered face filling every forward window like a wall falling toward them, and then a long, sickening swing as the tug's trajectory bent through 90 degrees of borrowed gravity and spat them out low and fast across the quarters floor, lined up on the hauler's wake. Daz flew it with his shoulders, the way the good ones do, and when it was over, he let out one breath that he'd apparently been saving since the burn. Started and said, okay, now we're in her neighborhood. Nobody tell my mother any part of that maneuver. The neighborhood was getting crowded. The long lens showed the deep furrow at 4,000 kilometers and closing. The torch, the slow gleam of the rolling spine, the dirty halo of mesh wreckage and drone fragments pacing her bow, and standing off at a respectful 500 kilometers, painted in the corridor office's pale ceremonial gray, the thing Okoye had been expecting since the second countermeasure failed. A warship. Spur Squadron command vessel, lance-armed, the kind of hull the Irvet kept for asteroid diversion and ceremonial review, and had not fired in anger, in living memory. Its lane transponder identified it as the Office of Correction. Of course it is, Hask said. The hail came on the official band, but Kavi's relay carried the internal traffic too. Whether by her hand or her negligence, no one ever asked. And so the Knuckleboom's crew got to hear the argument happen in both languages at once. The smooth one meant for them, and the real one underneath. The smooth version said, the Office of Correction will conduct a precision-disabling fire against the runaway hulls. Drive cluster. Unauthorized vessels will clear the engagement radius. The real version, the one between the warship's gunnery floor and the traffic floor, said, we have no firing solutions, we trust. The hull is precessing. The drive cluster crosses the lance line twice per roll, 8-second window, and behind the drive cluster sit the aft oar holds, and we have not fired this weapon at a moving target since any of us were commissioned. Okoye took the working band, and she didn't shout. Nia, listening from the engine room with her hands full of pre-burn checks, thought she would remember the master's voice in this minute for the rest of her life. A freight yard voice, unhurried, putting its words down like crates squared on a pallet. Office of Correction, this is the tug. Before you commit, walk one step past the success case with me. Say your lance hits the drive cluster clean. The drive doesn't switch off. It's a torch with fuel in the lines. It ruptures. The stern blooms, and now the hull's not thrusting, fine, but she's still doing 38 kilometers a second with 2 million tons of loose cargo and a broken back tumbling. On a track that still ends at your ring, you won't have stopped the freight train. You'll have taken its brakes off and opened the boxcars. A beat. And say you miss the cluster by 20 meters. You hole an oar hold instead. 2 million tons of centered cargo, pressure-packed. You'll turn a single solvable hull into a debris cone 400 kilometers wide, and there is no tug, no squadron, no prayer in this system that boards a debris cone. Your weapon cannot stop this. It can only change what kind of hit your ring takes. The pause on the official band lasted 11 seconds. Then a gunnery voice, translated stiff. The assessment is noted. The firing authority rests with the office. It always does, Okoye said to no one off-band. They fired once. To their credit. And Nia made herself keep that phrase too, because the day was going to need its credits counted honestly when it was over. Fired the smallest correction they believed in. A low-yield lance pulse aimed not at the drive cluster but at the C's gimbal ring itself. A surgeon's shot, meant to shock the warped bearing free so the hull's own dumb thrust would straighten and carry her past the ring on a clean miss. It was clever. It was even in a vacuum, correct. The engineer who proposed it had never had to work on machinery that had already been on fire once that day, and did not know the first law of the burned. What heat is welded, shock does not free. Shock breaks. The pulse hit the gimbal ring square. The bearing did not free. The mount casting, crystallized by the burnout's heat, cracked through, and the number 3 hold beside it. Its bulkhead already strained by the day's abuses, split along a seam 40 meters long. On the long lens it looked almost gentle. A seam of dust opening down the hauler's flank, silver gray in the sunlight like a pod going to seed. Then the dust kept coming and kept coming, a steady, silent torrent of sintered ore gravel venting into the dark at the pressure of 2 million tons of settling cargo, and the deep furrow grew a tail. A comet's tail, lit gold by her own torch, 10 kilometers long inside the first minute. And because the universe keeps its books with a clerk's pitiless neatness, the venting was thrust, crude, cold, asymmetric thrust on the hull's flank, day's third countermeasure and third backfire, and the long, slow roll began to flatten out under it, and the wandering thrust axis steadied, and the fat cone of possible futures on every tracking table in the system narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, until it was almost loving in its precision. A single line, terminating dead center on the inhabited arc of the Susuna ring in 4 hours and 9 minutes. Sector 12. Kavi's voice cracked when she read it off. Field Farms, a freight college, the oldest water gardens on the ring. 800,000 residents in the direct lethality radius, the rest of the ring downstream of whatever a 2 million ton impact does to a closed loop of habitat that has never in 4 centuries taken a hit bigger than a hailstone of paint flake. The Office of Correction did not fire again. The warship hung at her standoff distance, lance cold, and her gunnery floor went silent on both versions of the band. And Nia understood, without anyone saying it, the way the whole day had gone, that the silence was the sound of the official world finally fully arriving at the place the knuckle boom had started from 5 hours earlier. Every remote option was spent. Every standoff option made it worse. What remained was a problem you could only solve by sending bodies to stand on it. Knuckle boom, a new voice on the official band. Not the gunnery officer. Older, rougher, the command grade. The Office of Correction has no boarding doctrine for a hull under thrust. No, Okoye agreed. You wouldn't. It's not a doctrine. It's a trade. Can you do it? The master let the question sit just long enough to be honest. In the engine room, Nia found she had stopped breathing, both hands resting flat on the gauge bank, feeling her ship hum. We're going to find out in 40 minutes, Okoye said. Keep your lance cold and your medics warm, and stay out of our sky. What the trade knew, and the doctrine didn't, came down to one ugly truth Daz drew on the plot table for Timo's benefit while the tug ran up the hauler's wake. You cannot park next to a ship that is accelerating. There is no next to. The deep furrow was gaining speed every second. Anything floating beside her fell instantly astern. To board her, the knuckle boom would have to fly formation inside the envelope of her thrust. Nose down the same line, engines lit, matching the runaway's acceleration exactly. G for G, close enough alongside to throw lines across. 2 ships burning in lockstep, one of them dead, one of them small, through the gravel halo of a venting hold, with the torch of the hauler's drive cluster pouring its 200-meter flame less than a ship length below their boots. For how long? Timo asked. How long can we hold formation like that? Plant answer, Nia said from the saddle. 41 minutes at her current acceleration before I'm into the reserve we need for the break. After that, we're spectators. So the boarders get what? Half an hour aboard. The boarders get what the boarders get, Hask said, hauling the equipment cage open. Suit up. Varga, you're with me. It had never been discussed and didn't need to be. The boarding party picked itself the way it always does on a working boat. The rigger, because the crossing was rigging, and the engineer, because everything after the crossing was engineering. Okoye flew the tug. Nobody alive flew it better through close work. Daz held the formation. That was his shoulders. Timo ran comms and the winch boards, which he drilled on every dull week of his apprenticeship for exactly one afternoon like this. And if his hands shook while he ran the pre-checks, his readbacks didn't. Nia suited in the equipment bay with the ritual calm her first chief had beaten into her. Seals, gauges, tethers, tools, twice each, in the same order every time, Because the order is what your hands remember when your head stops working. Heavy rig suit, the armored kind, joints like a loader. Cutting torch, spreader jack, hand pump, breaker bars, a satchel of fittings and hose. Hask packed the heavier twin of the same kit, plus the line guns and the spooled high tensile that was going to be their road between ships. He caught her eye across the bay as the formation burn began, and the deck started its long, steady tremble. "Say your worries now," he said. "Both of us. Old Doc rule. Worries said out loud get smaller." "Welds," Nia said. "Everything on that hull's been through a fire and a lance shock. Every handhold I trust is a guess." She cinched the last strap. "Yours my knees," Hask said, "and dying somewhere this far from a pub. That's 2 worries. I'm old, I get 2. He grinned, all seams, and slapped his faceplate down, and the airlock swallowed them. The approach was Daz's masterpiece, and he flew it like a man diffusing something. The deep furrow's gravel tail had thinned since the hold's first torrent, but thinned at closing velocities is a word for people who have never done the closing. What remained around the hauler was a loose tumbling halo of sintered ore, pebble to fist to footlocker, every piece of it riding her course at her speed with small drunken velocities of its own, and the only road to her flank ran through it. The knuckle boom went in astern and low. Tucked into the cone, the hauler's own bulk swept clean, crawling up the wake with her load shield forward, the great, scarred, pusher-plate face of her, built to shove bergs and barge strings, repurposed in one radioed sentence into the largest umbrella in the trade's history. The strike started at 2 kilometers. Pebbles first, a dry rattle across the shield that came through the frames like gravel thrown at a shed, and then the heavier hits, spaced, a rhythmic, each one a flat, hard bang followed by Okoye's voice doing damage calls with the serenity of a woman reading tide tables. Floodlight array 2, gone. Forward camera mast gone. A footlocker-sized slab they never saw on any sensor took the rim of the shield at a shallow angle and rang the whole tug like a bell. And Nia, braced in the airlock with Hask, heard her new-tuned engine stutter, half a beat under the shock loading, catch itself on the surge dampers she'd rebuilt in dock 2 months ago for no reason anyone had asked of her, and sing on. "That one cost us paint," Okoye reported. "Boarding party, your road's intact. Reyes, talk me up the flank." Coming a beam of the rupture in 40 seconds. We hold under her belly through the worst of the vent stream, then climb her starboard side where the tail's thinnest. "Master, when we pop the cone, there'll be a sleet of fines off the hold seam, 10-12 seconds of it before we're in the lee. It'll be loud and it won't matter. Don't let it move your hands." "Nothing's moved my hands since the year you were born. Climb." The tug came out of the wake's shadow into sunlight and sleet together. The fines off the ruptured hold hit the shield face like the inside of a sandblaster, a roar that drowned the band, the engine, the blood in Naya's ears. 10 seconds, 11-12, a small violent forever, and then it was gone. Sheared off knife clean as the knuckle boom crossed into the dead air behind the hauler's flank, and the band came back, and the first thing on it was Timo whooping once before remembering he was a professional, and the second thing was Daz, dry as dock dust. Formation lock in 90 seconds. Welcome to the neighborhood, everybody. Mind the construction. The last 90 seconds were the strangest of Nia's life to that hour, because nothing in them moved. The 2 ships fell into matched burn, G for G, and the universe simply stopped. The hauler's vast riveted flank hanging frozen 80 meters off the airlock sill, the stars pinned, the gravel halo arrested mid-tumble like weather in a photograph, and the only evidence that both hulls were tearing through the corridor at 40 kilometers a second and gaining was the soft eternal thunder of 2 drives in lockstep and the propellant ledger on her wrist spending downward. 11 minutes of formation gone before a single boot had crossed. "Lock confirmed," Daz said. "Gap steady at 81 meters. Clocks running." Friends, outside was scale. Naya had boarded derelicts before. Cold ones, drifting, polite. Nothing in 7 years of the trade had prepared her body for standing braced in an open lock with the universe shaking, looking down a 1/4 kilometer of cable gap at the deep furrow underway. The hauler filled half of everything. A horizon of riveted gray hull back rolling gently below them like the flank of the world's biggest animal, fore and aft both lost to perspective, the seam of the ruptured hold glittering, as it bled its silver tail past them at a distance that read as close enough to touch, and was 80 meters, if it was anything. Below the curve of the hull, out of sight and never out of mind, the drive cluster roared in absolute silence, and its light came up off the venting gravel in gold flashes, and the whole impossible arrangement, the dead giant, the burning sky beneath it, the little tug bellowing alongside on matched fire, held together only as long as 4 hands on 2 sets of controls kept it held. "Gap steady," Daz said, voice flat with concentration. "Gravel's light at this station. You want my advice. Walk fast anyway." The line guns thumped. 2 grapnel heads crossed the gap trailing wire, struck the hauler's maintenance rail amidships of the spine and bit. Timo ran the tension up. The road existed. Boarding party, Okoye said. Go to work. The crossing was a thing Nia's body did while her mind stood slightly to one side. Taking notes, it would spend years refusing to read back. Clip on, swing out, and the tug was gone from under her boots, and the wire was the world. Under matched acceleration, the wire hung in a shallow curve between the ships like a footbridge in a gale. And crossing it wasn't flying, it was climbing, hand over hand down the sag and then up the far side, a third of a G dragging her boots aftward the whole way, her own weight trying to peel her off the line and post her into the torch glow below. She didn't look at the torch glow, she looked at her gloves. 8 years of ladders and gantries had taught her hands the rhythm, and the rhythm carried her, one bite of wire at a time, across 80 meters of nothing while 2 million tons of dead ship rose slowly to meet her like a landscape. Then her boots found the maintenance rail, and the magnets in them found the hull, and she was standing on the deep furrow. Standing was the word, that was the obscenity of it. The hull was under thrust, so the hull had a down, and the down was aft, which meant the great spine of the hauler wasn't a floor, it was a tower. She stood on the sheer face of a building 1.5 kilometers tall that was falling upward through the sky at a third of a G, and somewhere far below her boots the foundations were on fire, and the only direction that mattered all afternoon would be the climb forward, which was up. Hask landed beside her with a grunt that the comm faithfully delivered. He took one look down the endless riveted face of the spine aft, where perspective gathered everything into the glare. Right, he said. Nobody looks at the basement. Where's our door, Varga? She had the Vunge-class general arrangement drawings loaded in her wrist display, not because anyone had briefed her, but because the Combine filed hull schematics with the corridor's safety registry, where any contractor with a yard license could read them, and during the long burnout, she had done what the trade always does, her own homework. Maintenance trunk 3, 200 meters forward this face. It feeds the feed gallery and the gimbal vault both. The yard crews use it when she's docked for overhaul. Then it'll be honest, Hask said, which was rigor theology. The parts of a ship her own mechanics use are the parts you can trust. They climbed. The rail ran true, but the day's violence had been here before them. Twice they crossed sprays of bright metal where mesh wreckage had strafed the hull, and once a whole stanchion came away in Hask's grip, sheared at its weld, and dropped past Nia's shoulder and fell aft, down the tower, into the light, gone. Neither of them said anything. The suit radios carried their breathing, and the gravel made small dry rain sounds against their armor, pebbles of the venting cargo pattering across this face of the hull in slow looping arcs, and from inside the plating, conducted up through her boot soles, Nia could hear the deep furrow's body talking, the deep mindless groan of stressed frames, the feed line's eternal locomotive shudder, the heartbeat of machinery that did not know it had died. Maintenance trunk 3 had a yard-standard hatch with a yard-standard mechanical release, and it opened to Nia's breaker bar on the second heave, and that small, honest click of a counterweighted latch doing its job, 400 years of boring, careful engineering speaking through the chaos, steadied her more than anything since the squawk. Knuckle boom. Boarding party. We're in. In was a vertical shaft now, a ladderway meant to be a corridor, transformed by thrust into a climb down toward the stern, toward the noise and the heat, toward the gallery where the drive drank. They descended into the dark of a ship built blind. No viewports, no running lights, no cabin glow. The Vunda class had never carried an eye or needed one, and the blackness inside her was total. Primordial, broken only by their suit lamps and, as they dropped lower, by something Nia smelled through the suit's filters before she understood she shouldn't be able to. The air system was still running, and the air it ran was full of burned ship, scorched insulation, cooked copper, the candle-snuff stink of a fire that had eaten its own oxygen and died sealed in a steel room. The trunk air was breathable, said her wrist sensors, technically, and carried at a third of a G the same temperature as a foundry's doorway. Core compartment's 2 frames forward of the gallery, she said. That's the smell, it's the brain. It cooked slow, Hask. Look at the soot tide lines, hours, maybe a whole shift. The cooling loop must have failed at the catch, and she ran her whole acceleration program with a brain at fever, executing perfectly, right up until it wasn't a brain anymore. Save it for the inquiry. Door. The feed gallery received them with heat and voice. It was a cathedral of plumbing, a vaulted run of machinery space 200 meters long where 8 great feed trunks, each thick as a hallway, dropped from the ore-shadowed dark above and bent aft through their pump houses toward the drive cluster, and every surface in it sang. This was the live nerve of the runaway, fuel mass moving at tonnage rates through pipes the size of trams, pumps the size of cottages turning at their eternal governed speed, all of it conducted into the deck plates as a roar you stood inside of rather than heard. Their suit lamps swept across it and made the moving shadows of handrails swing like ship's rigging. And on every pump house, on every trunk, stenciled in Irvit's safety yellow and repeated in 3 scripts, the same beautiful, infuriating sign. A manual isolation gate. A real one. A great wheel and screw mechanical gate, brain-proof, fireproof, designed by those same cautious 4th-century engineers for exactly one purpose, so that a yard crew could make this ship safe with their hands when she was docked, cold, and pointed at nothing. 8 trunks, 8 gates, 8 chances to choke the torch. Nia got 2 hands on the first wheel, braced, and threw her suit's full augmented strength against it, and learned the day's central fact in one jarring instant. The wheel did not move, not stiff, not corroded. Welded, heat-welded in its threads by the burnout's long fever, the gate's screw and seat expanded into each other and cooled into a single piece of metal, and when she hung her whole armored weight off the spokes, the wheel flexed like something laughing at her. "Talk to me," Okoye said in her ear. "Gates are heat-seized. All of them, if the first one's a sample." She was already unshipping the spreader jack, mind sprinting ahead of her hands down the branching tree of the trade's next moves. Because there is always a next move. That was the first thing the engine rooms had ever taught her. Machinery is never finished saying no, we can break them. Spreader on the spokes, torch the seat collar to shock the threads, hand pump for the last of it. But it's not a minute apiece, Master, it's 15. 20 for the stubborn ones. Call it 3 hours of work for all 8. You have 38 minutes of formation left and 3 hours. 9 on the clock to the ring, Daz said. So faster or different? Different. Nia turned, lamp sweeping, doing arithmetic with her eyes, on the 8 trunks, on the pump houses, on the great aft wall of the gallery, beyond which the gimbal vault held its cracked and seized machinery. The numbers were doing something interesting, and interesting was the most dangerous word in the trade. Master, listen. Killing the drive isn't actually job 1, that's the part everyone gets wrong from a desk. If I choke all 8 banks right now, this second, she goes ballistic, on the impact line. The vent's been steering her for an hour. Dead stick, she still hits Sector 12, just colder. Before anyone strangles anything, somebody has to point this thing somewhere else. The pause on the channel had the whole day inside it. The gimbal's cracked and seized, Okoye said. Office shot it personally. The gimbal mount casting is cracked and seized, and nobody's re-aiming a nozzle the size of a grain silo with a hand pump anyway. Nia was moving now aft along the gallery catwalks, lamps ahead of her, the schematic glowing on her wrist. But thrust direction isn't just the nozzle, Master, it's the flow. 8 feed banks, 8 combustion sectors spaced round the cluster. They're balanced, that's why she flies straight. Choke them out of balance and the thrust vector walks. Kill once inside's banks first. The cluster pushes lopsided and the whole hull yaws around her own center of mass. She steers exactly once. Slow and ugly and with no second tries, but 2 degrees is a 400-kilometer miss at this range and I only need. She checked the wrist plot, made herself say it carefully. I need 1 degree and 3/4, sustained for 6 minutes, starting inside the next half hour. Then we choke the rest in opposed pairs, staged so the manifold doesn't hammer and blow the stern off. Then everyone gets to be ballistic and bored. Static hiss, light lag breathing, the channel's whole little nation considering it. Warden Kavi here, I ran it past the floor. A pause. The floor says the order matters more than anything in their models. Wrong sequence, and you steer her along the ring instead of off it. They're sending sector-by-sector flow ratings now, they also say, and here the young warden's flatness cracked, just once, into something with weather in it. They say no one has ever flown a Vund class. They were built so no one would have to. You'd be the first. Hask was already laying out the spreader jack and the torch bottles at the first wheel on the gallery's port side. Oldest rigor logic, work begun being the only argument that ever wins. He looked up the soaring dark of the feed trunks and then over at Nia, and behind his faceplate, in the lamp glow, the seamed old face was doing something that on a younger man might have been called delight. First in 400 years, he said. And it's a sheet metal crew with a hand pump. Of course it is. It was always going to be. He set the spreader's jaws on the wheel spokes. Well, engineer, which side of this animal do we choke first? Nia looked at her wrist, at the 8 great trunks in their soot-stained ranks, at 3 hours of work folded against 30-some minutes of formation time, and gave the only order of her life that would ever appear, lovingly diagrammed in 2 species textbooks. Port side, banks 7 and 5, we turn her into the vent. Bank 7's gate fought them for 11 minutes. The procedure they invented on it, because nobody had ever written one, became the procedure for the day. Torch the seat collar in a ring until the heat-welded threads shrieked and shifted. Set the spreader's jaws across the wheel spokes and jack until the spreader's gauge stood at loads that made Nia's teeth ache. Then both of them on the breaker bars, boots braced on the pump house, hauling in the short, brutal pulls Hask called worrying it, like dogs with a root. The wheels surrendered all at once, the way seized metal does, a quarter turn that nearly threw them both off the catwalk, and then it spun free and easy, an almost gracious 30 turns down to the seat, and somewhere beneath their boots a tram-sized pipe swallowed and went still. 1/8 of the torch died. They felt it more than heard it, a fractional sag in the eternal locomotive shudder. The first change anyone or anything had imposed on the deep furrow since her brain cooked. Flows down on 7, confirmed off the plume spectrals, Timo reported, voice cracking with what was unmistakably joy. That's the first thing today that's gone smaller instead of bigger. 5. Go, was all Nia said, because the risk plot was already showing her the cost of celebrating. The thrust imbalance was real now, and the hull knew it. Bank 5 took 9 minutes, the procedure already smoother, and as the second gate sank to its seat, the deep furrow began, with the unhurried magnificence of very large things, to swing. The yaw was nothing the body could feel, 1/10 of a degree a second at its best, but it was everything the structure could feel, and the structure said so. The whole gallery groaned around them like sea ice. Feed trunks built to carry their loads dead vertical took up bending stresses their designers had never built them for. Catwalks whined. Somewhere forward, a frame member let go with a crack that arrived through Nia's boots like a kicked-in veil. On the plot, the line of the hauler's nose crept off the lethal heading, walking degree by slow degree away from Sector 12, and the channel carried the sound of an urban traffic floor, discovering in real time what cheering was. It lasted 90 seconds. Then Cavi's voice cut through her own floor's noise, flat again, flat as a dropped blade. Knuckle boom, the projections walking back. The vent papers motion, a curse in untranslated Urvet. The hold's interior baffles are collapsing as it empties. The vent thrust is migrating. Every kilo of turn you buy, the leak is respending somewhere new. Current cone puts her back across the inhabited arc inside 40 minutes. And my floor can't model where it stops, because nothing about that hold is stable enough to model. Haas said something filthy and sincere. Nia stood with one glove on the dead wheel of Bank 5 and watched her clean degree and 3/4 dissolve into the day's general weather, and understood, with the strange calm that lives on the far side of fury, the actual shape of the job. A miss wasn't a thing you could buy from this hull and trust. The leak would keep steering her all the way in, drunk and senile and random. As long as the deep furrow was moving at the ring, somebody's town was in the error bars. There was only one version of this afternoon where the error bars stopped mattering. "Master," she said slowly, "we've been solving the wrong problem. We keep trying to make her miss. Forget missing." She turned and looked down the gallery, aft, toward the heat and the roar, toward the 6 banks still feeding the long fire, and the idea arrived whole, the way they do at the bottom of the tree, when everything reasonable is already crossed off. "She's got hours of propellant and a drive we can't kill fast. Fine. Then we don't fight the burn. We aim it. We let her keep swinging past the misheading all the way around, nose for tail, and we park her stern toward the ring and let that animal of a drive spend every one of those tons of thrust braking. She's been running away from us all day." Her own voice surprised her, how level it came out. "We turn her around and she stops." Silence on the band, the deep kind, 3 light seconds wide, the sound of 2 species worth of professionals rederiving the same arithmetic at once. Daz got there first naturally. She's doing 39 and change relative. At 1/3 of a G, that's the better part of 3 hours of braking and 200,000 clicks of road, and she's got maybe 400,000 left to the shell. He laughed once, disbelieving, offended, converted. "It fits. Master, the lunatic's right, it fits, but only if the flip happens now. Every minute of a swing costs miss distance, and every minute we argue costs both." "The floor concurs," Kavi said, seconds later, breathless, not bothering to pretend she hadn't been relaying everything live. "The floor," Director Vorlon concurs. "The Office of Correction will clear the braking corridor." A beat. "He asks what you require." "Requires," Okoye echoed, with 30 years of unbriefed weather in the word. Then evenly, 3 things. "Keep that lance cold. Keep our sky empty, and start clearing Sector 12 anyway, because in this trade plans are made of the same metal as everything else, and metal fails." The flip was 26 minutes of the worst work of Nia Varga's life, and she did the first 8 of it on her knees, because that was where Bank 2's gate wheel was. The choreography came off the corridor office floor in shouted relays, which Bank's burning drove, the swing which opposed pair would catch it, the timing of the catch sliding constantly as the vent's drunken thrust wandered, and it all funneled down the band to 2 suited figures with a spreader jack and a torch, scrambling between pump houses on a catwalk grid built for inspection strolls. "Free the gate. Stage it half closed. Hold. Now Bank 2 hard down, the hull's swing rate climbing past every projection. Now free Bank 4 and stand by to catch," and the catch windows were single minutes wide and they moved. The deep furrow swung through her own tail. The venting gravel that had streamed astern came briefly abeam, then ahead, and for 2 endless minutes the hull waded nose first through her own glittering exhaust of cargo, the patter on the plating rising to a long mineral roar like driving rain on a tin roof, the catwalks shivering. Visibility in the gallery's open vault stretches cut to lamp glow in a storm of dust. Somewhere in it, the broken vane housing forward, mauled once by the mesh wreck and once by the lance, finally surrendered its grip on a slab of cowling the size of a barn door. The hull rang. The slab went tumbling down the gallery's exterior face, shedding bolts, and Nia heard the sound she would dream about later on the bad nights. Hask's grunt cut short. He was 8 meters aft of her, at bank 4, and the cowling hadn't hit him. What had hit him was the catwalk's reaction to it, the whole grid flexing like a struck cable, snapping him boots first off his stance and down into the gap between the walk and the pump house wall, where a third of a G did what it does to a falling mass and the structural channel he landed across did what steel does to legs. "Hask, I'm here." Gravel voiced, immediate, the discipline of 40 years answering before the pain could organize itself. "I'm stop. Don't leave that gate, Varga. You're mid-catch. Finish the catch." He was right, and she hated it, and she finished the catch 11 more turns on Bank 4's wheel. Eyes on her wrist, the hull's great swing decelerating exactly on the floor's revised mark. And then she was over the rail and down beside him with her lamps and her hands and the suit's medical readouts painting the inside of her faceplate in colors she didn't want. Left leg, 2 breaks below the knee, the armor's joint crushed into the structural channel and holding the whole mess rigid, which was the suit accidentally doing splint duty. Suit, integrity green, pain readouts off the chart, and his voice still level, the way that generation's voices stayed level, out of sheer refusal to be unprofessional in front of an apprentice trade. "Tell me the swing," he said, while she rigged the recovery sling under his arms, caught dead on the mark. She's stern to the ring and the floor's calling the attitude stable inside a degree. She heaved. He came free of the channel with a sound neither of them acknowledged. The sling took his weight. "Braking burn's been live for 90 seconds, Hask. She's slowing. 2 million tons slowing. Course she is." His breath came in, freight car couplings, bang, bang, slow. "Machinery's honest, girl. It was never her fault. All she ever wanted since her brain burned was for somebody to come stand on her and tell her which way to push." A cough. "Get me somewhere I can lie down lordly, and then go strangle the rest of her, nice and even. I'll supervise. I'm management now." She parked him in the maintenance trunk's bottom landing, out of the gallery's weather, lashed to honest pad eyes. His kit and a waterline in reach and the band live in his helmet, and Okoye's voice met her there, private circuit, quieter than the master ever let the crew hear. "Status on my rigger, honest version. Stable, splinted by his own armor, grounded somewhere safe. He needs a surgical bay inside 6 hours, and he's getting that long out of suit reserves easy." Nia took one breath. "Master, I'm now a boarding party of 1, with 6 live banks, a braking schedule that has to be hand-staged to the floor's curve or the manifold hammers, and 40 kilometers a second of arithmetic between 11 million people in the evening news. I know what you are, Varga. No comfort offered. Something better, the thing the master had instead. I also know there is no person in this corridor of any species with or without a commission better placed or better made for the next 2 hours than you. The formation reserves at its line. I'm dropping the tug astern to save the brake margin. You'll have us back at the end, nose on when the fine work starts. Until then, the only hands on 2 million tons are yours." A pause. "The office never briefed us today. I never briefed you for this. Notice how it hasn't mattered." Nia stood alone at the head of the feed gallery, in the roar and the heat and the lamp-cut dark of a ship that no one had ever stood inside underway, and looked down the long ranks of the 6 gates between her and nightfall, and discovered her hands had stopped feeling small. "Knuckle boom clear," she said. "Boarding party holds the hull." On the Sasuna ring in Sector 12, the evening had a new star. It stood low over the planet's limb where no star belonged, brilliant and unwinking, and it grew. The ring's public feeds had spent the afternoon repeating the corridor office's first statement, unverified anomaly, observe normal operations. And so the water gardens and the freight college heard of the matter was the shelter order, arriving between the dinner hour and dusk shift with a bluntness no Irvet public notice had used in a century. Residents of sectors 11 through 14 will proceed now to storm footings. Now was not a word the ring's signage fonts had been designed to carry. It looked, survivors of the evening would say later, like the architecture itself raising its voice. At the freight college, an instructor of cargo handling named Ossel Vance, 40 years on the ring, dock certified, the closest thing Sector 12's teaching staff had to a working trade, got her 200 students moving toward the footings with a stevedore's economy, no speeches, count by rows, walk fast and carry nothing. In the stairwell press, One of the young ones asked her the question the feeds weren't answering. What is it? Instructor, what's actually coming? And Osel Vance, who had spent the last hour doing what doc-certified people everywhere do in a blackout of official information, finding the unofficial kind, held up her hand terminal where a patch-through scratch of audio was playing low in a language none of them spoke. Listen, she said, that band is a working channel. Cargo handlers like you'll be. The trouble is real, and it's headed here, and the government will tell you about it eventually. The stairwell shuffled and creaked around them. On the terminal, very far away, a flat human voice said something rhythmic about wheel counts, and another voice, older gravelly, answered it. But hear how they're talking. Short, even. Numbers in every sentence. Nobody talks like that running away from a thing. Cubs. They talk like that standing on it. She pocketed the terminal and shooed the row ahead of her downward. Whatever it is, somebody's hands are already on it. Walk fast anyway. The clip of her saying it, some student had been recording. Students always are. Went out across the sheltering ring inside the hour, and that was the actual moment. Historians of the evening generally agree that 11 million people stopped refreshing the dead official feeds and went looking for Band 6. The Corridor Office's Information Directorate convened an emergency session on whether relaying an unauthorized foreign working channel to the public violated statute. The session was still arguing when somebody on the traffic floor, the logs, reviewed afterward, showed the patch originating from a junior warden station at the pool's rim, and no disciplinary action was ever so much as drafted, routed the band to the shelter footings public address system directly. On the reasoning she typed into the action field with characteristic flatness. They are owed the sound of the hands, so the footings heard it live, packed shoulder to shoulder in the ring's structural roots. Under the great trusses their grandparents had built, 800,000 Ervet listened to the wrong species work, the wheel counts, the flow numbers, the cadence of the old one coaching and the young one answering, the long stretches of nothing but breathing and machinery, which the doc certified among them translated for their neighbors. That's not silence, that's concentration. You want that silence. That silence is the job going well. Parents held up small children to the address horns the way an earlier century would have held them up to see a procession. It made no sense and everyone did it. 60 years on two worlds, there would be gray-furred Ervet who could not hear a human count past 3 without their throat closing, and who never once managed to explain it to their own grandchildren in a way that survived the telling. Vorlin authorized none of it and stopped none of it. He stood on the supervisor's walk above his floor, watching the lawful architecture of his office reroute itself around the emergency like water around a stone, every channel of it converging on a 40-year-old foreign tug and a voice 7 ranks below his own, and made no entry in the log. Much later, at the inquiry, a panelist would ask him why. The lane director considered the question with his hands folded and gave the answer that did more for his species standing in human dockside establishments than any treaty before or since. Because by the dinner hour I had been wrong 3 times, at scale with instruments, he said. An official who cannot recognize the moment to stop helping is not an official. He is a 4th countermeasure. Ulith Kavi watched the sheltering on the traffic floor's secondary tables, 800,000 dots draining out of the habitat levels into the ring structural roots, orderly, frightened, slow, so impossibly slow, and listened with half an ear as behind her on the supervisor's walk, the most powerful lane official in the system gave away his life's posture, 1 sentence at a time. No, combined counsel may not review the release before it goes out. Vorlin's voice had found something underneath its office. The release says what happened. Your hull went runaway. Your telemetry lied about it for 3 hours on my floor, and the parties currently correcting your property are a 5-person human towing crew operating without authorization, because every authorized response this office attempted has made the situation worse. That is the text. It goes out under my seal. A pause. Because it is true, counsel. We have 11 million reasons to start saying true things on time. He came down from the walk afterward and stood beside her at the pool, unprecedented. Directors did not stand at the pool, and together they watched the red thread's velocity ladder tick downward, 4 meters a second slower with every second's tick, a number turning visibly, physically mortal in front of them. You routed them the optical track, he said. Not a question. Hours before I authorized anything. Yes, Director. On a maintenance flag. Yes, Director. He was silent for a moment. On the table, fine as a hair against the hauler's bulk, the little transponder dot of the human tug held its station astern of the monster, patient, like a pilot fish. My grandmother kept the lane boards when this office was 4 desks and a telescope, Vorlin said. She had a saying I spent my career classifying as sentiment. The corridor does not care whose channel the trouble arrives on. He straightened the hem of his gray sleeve very precisely, the gesture of a man rebuilding himself around a removed load-bearing belief. When this is over, Lane Warden, remind me that I owe the cheap end of the spectrum an apology drafted to survive translation. Aboard the Deep Furrow, the breaking hours had a texture Nia would never quite render in words for anyone who hadn't worked a doubled shift somewhere loud. Time going by in pump house increments, the universe contracting to the next gate, the next stage point, the next reading. The floor's braking curve came down the band as a schedule. Bank 1 half-staged at this mark. Banks 3 and 6 trimmed to balance the vent's dying flutters. Nothing moved fast. Nothing moved alone, and she executed it gate by gate, with the spreader and the torch and the pump, her suit's strength augmentation running hot, her hands inside the gauntlets blistering at the pressure points, her mind narrowed to flow numbers and wheel counts, and Hask's voice rationing out, rigor wisdom from the trunk landing like a foreman who happened to be horizontal. Don't rush the half stage. The manifold's a long animal. It hears a fast valve all the way down its spine, and what it does about it is called hammer. And hammer at these flow rates opens hulls. I know what hammer is, Hask. You know it in a tug. Everything that animal does, it does 2 million tons at a time. Treat her like the biggest pipe organ ever built, and you're the only thing alive that knows the hymn. The velocity ladder fell. 35 kilometers a second relative. 31. The plume spectrals off the drive cluster, relayed by a warship that had quietly repositioned itself to serve as the tug crew's sensor platform. Gunnery floor turned observatory, nobody remarking on the conversion out loud, showed the burn steady, the combustion sectors balanced, the monster pulling honestly against her own headlong day. 26. The ruptured hold coughed out its last torrent and went dry, the comet tail thinning to a haze and then to nothing, and with it died the drunken side thrust that had steered the afternoon toward catastrophe. Kavi read out the cone of futures collapsing to a clean line, and the line ended, for the first time since the squawk, short of the shell. 22, 20. At 19 kilometers a second, with her left arm cramping at the spreader and 4 hours since anything had been food, Nia leaned her helmet briefly against the dead wheel of Bank 6, listened to 2 million tons obey her, and laughed at nothing, alone in the roaring dark the way you laugh when the day finally agrees to be merely enormous. At 17 kilometers a second, Bank 1 tried to kill the plan. It went wrong in the patient way, which is the worst way. The half stage went in sweet, the wheel turning easy under her hands, 11 turns 12, and on the 13th the wheel stopped answering, not seized. Worse, loose. The wheel spun a quarter turn with no load on it at all, the feel of a stripped thread or a sheared key, and the flow gauge on Bank 1's pump house sat fat and unmoved at 3/4 open with the curve's next stitch due in 9 minutes and the gate, hanging somewhere in the dark of its housing, connected to nothing she could reach. Talk, Okoye said, who could hear trouble in the quality of a silence. Bank 1's gate just went orphan. Linkage failure inside the housing, the wheels turning a dead shaft. She stuck 3/4 open. Nia was already walking the trunk with her lamps, following the great pipes run aft, mine sprinting down the branching tree. The tree was short this time. Inside the housing was a day and a yard with a crane. There was no day and no crane and no yard. If one won't stage down on schedule, the brake curve's wrong from here in. We come up hot at the finish, not impact hot, but she'll still be making way at the boundary, and the floor's whole stitching is junk. Light lag carried the sound of an Irvit traffic floor going very quiet again. Options, the master said. Out loud, that's how it works. Restitch the curve around a fat Bank 1. The floor holds other banks higher longer, and we move every remaining mark later and steeper. She heard the floor start shouting before Kavi's relay caught up. They'd reached the same place. It means the endgame compresses. The last 3 stages land inside the final 6 minutes instead of the final 20. It means I do the closeout at a run. Or nothing, master. That's the tree. A pause. Then from the trunk landing 200 meters forward, gravel down a wire. Girl, whose pump feeds that gate's hydraulic assist? Nia stopped walking, stood absolutely still in the roar. Then she swore, once with reverence, and was already climbing. The gate's got a yard assist circuit. Hask, you beautiful antique. The linkage is sheared, but the gate itself still has. It's assist cylinder, and the assist cylinder has a yard coupling, and I am carrying. She was down on her knees at the pump house's service panel, satchel open, hands throwing fittings a hand pump and 50 bar of stubborn. It took 19 minutes that the curve could not spare and bought back everything it spent. She cracked the service panel, found the assist coupling under a century's lacquer of heat varnish, mated her hand pump's line on the third furious try, and drove the orphan gate down its last quarter travel 1 pump stroke at a time. 240 strokes, her shoulder a white coal, Hask counting cadence on the band, because counting cadence was a thing his voice could still do for her, the floor restitching the curve in real time around each 10-stroke flow report. When the gate seated, the gallery's note dropped a tone, and somewhere on a stone floor 3 light seconds away, 40 wardens listening to a hand pump's rhythm over a plumber's channel heard it stop and understood, and the sound they made came down the relay like weather. Bank 1 staged. Full seat, Nia said, lying on her back on the catwalk, watching her own breath fog the faceplate. Floor, your curve's honest again. Somebody write down that the antique saved the schedule. The record will show, Kavi said gravely, that the schedule was saved by 50 bar of stubborn. The trouble announced itself, as the day's trouble had learned to, through a number that wouldn't sit still. Feed pressure, bank 8. It had been sagging for an hour, expected. The propellant mass was draining down, and the pressurization system was a casualty of the burnout running on its dumbest backups. But at the 11-kilometer mark, the sag steepened, and the pump house instruments, the mechanical dial kind, the kind that don't know how to lie, began to flutter. Nia put her glove flat on Bank 8's pump casing and felt what she'd been dreading since the gallery first taught her its weather. The smooth cottage-sized purr roughening, a granular intermittent grind, the unmistakable feel of a pump starting to chew vapor instead of liquid. Cavitation, she said to the band. Bank 8's running toward dry slam. When the feed column flashes, that pump's going to eat its own impeller at full speed, and the manifold gets all of that as hammer. At current drawdown, call it 40 minutes. Then stage 8 down now, and we finish the break on the others, Daz said. Can't. She was already moving, lamps swinging, satchel banging her hip, back toward the one gate whose wheel she knew best. The first wheel, the sample wheel, the one that had flexed at her like something laughing 6 hours in a lifetime ago. 8's gate isn't seized like the others were seized. I've been back at it twice between stage points. The lance shock did something the rest didn't get. The screw's not heat welded, it's bent, cocked in its seat. The spreader's got nothing to push against. That doesn't make it worse. That gate is never closing, not for me, not for a yard, not for anybody. Bank 8 stages down when Bank 8's feed is starved, and that's the only way it stages down. Starved how? Okay. The tug was inbound again on the plot, riding up the braking corridor with the reserve she'd hoarded an hour out from the fine work. The maintenance purge. Nia reached the pump house and dropped to the deck plates beside the thing she'd been quietly engineering in her head for 2 hours, because the trade's oldest survival skill is starting the next problem before the current one is finished. The purge spur, a meter-wide branch line teed off Bank 8's trunk upstream of the pump, blanked with a bolted flange, built so the yard could drain and flush the bank when the ship docked for overhaul. I pull the blank, I rig the spur to vent overboard through the inspection chase, and when the floor's curve says 0, I open the purge and dump the bank's feed column straight into space. The pump sucks vacuum, the sector flames out clean before it can slam, and the drive dies on schedule. Torque wrench already on the first flange bolt. There's an or else, master. The purge spur empties that column in about 90 seconds once it's open, and there is no shutting it again. Purge valves are one way by design, drain and flush. So the timing isn't mine anymore once I pull this blank. If we open it early, the drive dies early, and she coasts whatever's left uncorrected. The last of the braking has to be right, because we only get to stop pedaling once. Then Kavi, and behind her the rising voices of a floor doing the same arithmetic at the same speed. Knuckle boom, corridor office. The curve says her 0 point, full relative stop, falls 26 kilometers short of the ring's traffic boundary if the burn holds true to the last. 26 kilometers on a day that started with an impact solution. A breath, and then the warden put the floor's whole long afternoon into one flat, dry line, and the trade would quote it on 2 Worlds for years. Recommend you do not miss by much. The last hour belonged to everyone at once, and that was the strangeness of it. After a day of working alone in the dark, the whole corridor leaned in. The knuckle boom came up the braking lane and took station off the deep furrow, close enough now that Nia, climbing the trunk to check on Hass between stage points, could put her lamps out the open hatch and see her own ship hanging in the black like a lit kitchen window seen from a night field. The Office of Corrections stood sentinel abeam, every sensor she owned trained on the plume, feeding spectrals to the floor and the floor's curve to Timo and Timo's relays down to the gallery, an entire chain of command reorganized in one afternoon into something simpler and older, people taking turns holding the light. And the ring watched. There was no helping it. The shelter footings had feeds. 800,000 Ervet packed into the structural roots of sectors 11 through. 14 watched the new star over the planet's limb. The star that was a drive plume pointed at them, the star that was either their death breaking or their death approaching, deciding which with every minute, and what the feeds gave them to listen to, because it was the only live audio of the event in existence, was Band 6, a human working channel. Wheel counts and flow numbers, an old man's pain-tight coaching, a pilot's dry arithmetic, a tugmaster's level freight yard voice, and under it all the young engineer breathing hard between gates, narrating 2 million tons to sleep. Linguists would write theses on it. 11 million people's first sustained exposure to human speech, and it was this. Bank 3's half stage is in. She took it sweet. Pressure's singing a little on the seat, but it's holding. Going to 6 kilometers a second. 5. The hauler's deceleration was easing now as Nia walked the banks down the curve in their opposed pairs. The design of the endgame, thrust stepping down as velocity stepped down. The monsters pulled gentling as the finish line rose to meet her, so that the final meters of speed would die under the final fraction of fire with nothing left over. The staging had to land on the curve's marks like stitches. Fast was catastrophe. Slow was a coast into the shell. Nia's universe was wheel counts. Her suit had stopped being equipment hours ago and become a fact of her body, sweat-sodden, chafed raw at the collar ring, the gauntlet blisters gone from pain to information. Twice her vision grayed at the edges from plain exhaustion, and twice she wrote it down, braced on a wheel, counting flow numbers out loud until the world rearmed itself. Varga, Hask, on the private circuit, somewhere in the 4th hour of lying lordly on a trunk landing with 2 broken bones. When this is done, I'm telling the story in every dockside establishment between here and the belt, and in my version you'll have done it one-handed. In my version you fell down a ladder you'd been told twice to clip onto. That's fair. We'll both lie. It's tradition. A pause, his breathing doing its freight car couplings. You hear it, don't you, in the deck? She heard it. The gallery's roar had changed register over the last hour, descending, softening, the locomotive shudder spacing itself out as bank after bank went down to its seat. The sound of the largest moving thing either species had ever lost control of being talked, pipe by pipe, back into stillness. It was, Nia thought, the sound of the day reversing itself. All afternoon the scale of it had landed on her in increments. Hull and tower and tail and tonnage, bigger and bigger. And now the same scale was leaving the same way, increment by increment, surrendered gate by surrendered gate, until what remained shivering in the plates under her boots was nearly small, nearly a ship, nearly just work. 1.5 kilometers a second, Timo relayed. Banks 1 and 4 down full, remaining thrust on 2 and 8 only. 0 point holding at 26 clicks short. Floor says, a pause, the boy audibly deciding he was allowed to edit an alien government in real time. Floor says all marks from here are yours, Nia. They're curves out of stitches. It's hands now. Hands now. She stood at Bank 2's gate with the purge lanyard from Bank 8's rigged spur led across the catwalk to her left glove, 50 meters of braided. Cable she'd run herself, because when the 0 point came she would have seconds, not minutes, and no time to cross between pump houses. The geometry of the last move had the brutal simplicity the whole day had been distilling toward. Bank 2, stageable, obedient hers. Bank 8, unkillable except by starvation, its purge irreversible once pulled. The drive's last 2 sectors had to die together at 0, balanced. If 2 died and 8 lingered even half a minute, its lone off-axis sector would shove the parked monster slowly, stupidly sideways, and sideways at 26 kilometers grace, pointed where the leak-built drift already tended, was the ring. Speed, she said. 800 meters a second, Daz read. You are currently the fastest decelerating municipal disaster in recorded history, and I want it noted I've started breathing again. 600. 550. Knuckleboom, get on her nose. Okoye's order, but Nia had heard the master and the floor build it together over the past hour. The contingency, the tug's last job, the reason the reserve had been hoarded like sin. Whatever lateral drift survived the flameout, leak built, flameout built, or born of plain mechanical spite, something had to be placed to cancel it. And there was exactly one object in the corridor designed to put its nose on a hull and push with precision. We'll take her bow gently and hold her off the line. Varga, you call your own marks. We're under you. The tug slid across the stars outside the gallery's ruptured exterior face, thrusters feathering, and set her blunt working nose against the deep furrow's forward quarter with the tenderness of a draft horse leaning into a stalled cart. Contact came through the plates as the day's gentlest sound. 300 meters a second, Daz said. 250. Nia put both hands on Bank 2's wheel. Somewhere below her boots, the last of the fire pulled against the last of the speed. On the feeds, 8,000 sheltering Irvet watched the star over the limb begin at long last to dim. 200, 150. Staging 2, Nia said, and turned the wheel to its half mark, and the deck's shudder halved. The hull, nearly massless feeling now in its obedience, trembled like a held breath. 170. Floor confirmed 0 point in 51 seconds. Nia, Des' voice lost its dryness for the first time all day. On your call. She watched her wrist. The numbers walked down. The whole corridor, the tug on the nose, the warship abeam, the stone floor across 3 light seconds, the rings packed dark footings, the old man in the trunk, the boy on the boards, hung silent inside the radio with her, and Nia Varga, second engineer 25, 7 years in engine rooms, unbriefed, unauthorized, and exactly where she was made to be, counted 2 million tons down to a standstill. 30 meters a second, 2010, killing 2, pulling 8. She spun Bank 2's wheel to the seat and hauled the lanyard with her whole body. And 50 meters away, the purge blank she'd rigged blew open, and Bank 8's feed column flashed out into vacuum in a long silver flag, and the pump sighed dry, and the last combustion sector guttered, starved, flickered, and the deep furrows drive after 9 hours, 14 minutes, and one entire civilization's worth of failed countermeasures went out. The silence arrived like a physical blow. Thrust ended, weight ended, down ended. Naya's boots left the catwalk and her tethers caught her, and around her 2 million tons of metal, weightless, coasting at a speed her wrist display rendered as a column of beautiful zeros, rang on quietly into stillness like a struck bell finishing its note. Contact thrust, Okoye said, far away, perfectly calm. Easy, easy. There's her drift, canceling. Hold, through the plates, fainter than a heartbeat. Naya felt her own ship push. The tug's engines, the engines she had nursed past their ratings since dawn, leaned their last hoarded tons of effort against the monster's bow and shaved away the sideways creep meter by meter, centimeter by centimeter, the final arithmetic of the day conducted at the scale of a hand steadying a glass. Drift zero, Daz whispered. All stop. All stop confirmed by the floor. Position. He didn't finish. So Kavi did, from the pool's rim on a stone floor where 40 wardens had risen to their feet, her flatness finally and entirely failing her. Position. 26.4 kilometers short of the Sasuna traffic boundary. Relative velocity 0, she's parked. A sound behind her voice like a tide coming in, which was an Irvet traffic floor learning what cheering was for the second time in one afternoon. Corridor office to the tug knuckleboom and boarding party. The deep furrow is at rest. The tide rose over her, you may secure from chase. Securing from chase took 11 hours, because that is the other thing nobody ever briefs anyone about. The rescue ends and the work doesn't. The first work was Hask. With the thrust gone, the trunk was a corridor again instead of a shaft, and Nia hauled herself back along it on the handrails to find the old rigger floating in his lashings with his eyes shut and his vitals stubborn and his sense of occasion fully operational. He opened one eye as her lamps found him. Did we win? Or is this the soft hallucination they promise you at the end? She's parked. 26.5 clicks short. 26.5. He closed the eye again, and his voice did something rough at the bottom. On the ring, they'll think that's close. Tell them in this trade that's a continent. Getting a man with 2 broken bones out of a dead hull was the kind of problem the day had at least left them friends for. The Office of Corrections Medical Launch matched and docked at Maintenance Trunk 3 with textbook care, the first Irvet hull ever to touch a Vund class under anything but yard conditions, a statistic nobody aboard had attention to spare for, and the Irvet medics came up the trunk in their pale, wide-jointed hard suits, and there on a catwalk landing lit by human suit lamps, the 2 species of the long afternoon finally saw each other's faces. The lead medic stopped. Behind the faceplate, the slate-gray features with their deep amber eyes went through a sequence Nia couldn't read then and would learn later when she knew Irvet faces. It was the expression they wore at the edge of deep water. The medic looked at Hask, lashed and splinted in his scarred orange armor, at Nia, kneeling beside him with her gauntlets burned and her suit bleached with vented propellant rime. At the gallery beyond them, the ranks of strangled gates receding into the dark of a machine their whole civilization had agreed could not be boarded. You are the voice from the band, the medic said at last to Nia, through the collar's careful translation. The one who counted. One of them. The patient's the one who taught me the counting. The medic crouched, opened the trauma kit with hands that were all professional motion again, and said, conversationally, to Hask as if resuming an interrupted acquaintance of years, Sir, I listened to 9 hours of your species today. I am given to understand you fell down a ladder. Hask's laugh hurt him, and he did it anyway, all the way to the launch. The Combine's salvage tender arrived at hour 5 with lawyers aboard, which the trade could have predicted, and at hour 6, the lawyers experienced the misfortune of discovering that lane director Hesh Vorlin had arrived first. What passed between them passed on Irvet channels, but Kavi, who had stopped pretending not to relay things, on the reasonable grounds that nobody had stopped her yet, and who had come across to the parked hauler with the second wave of inspectors because she had spent 9 hours staring at a red thread and needed, she said, to put her hand on the actual metal, gave the tug crew the working summary. Afterward, in the Knuckleboom's narrow galley, holding a bulb of human tea like it might require diffusing. Combining counsel attempted to serve an unauthorized boarding claim against you, against the tug. She turned the bulb slowly. The director let them finish reading it, the whole document. Then he asked one question, whether the Combine wished the office's incident record, the complete record, with the telemetry timestamps, published before or after the claim was filed because protocol required the two to travel together. A sip, a small wince at what tea was. Another sip anyway, which Nia thought was probably the whole afternoon in miniature. There is no claim. There will be no claim. There is, I am told, going to be a fee dispute about who pays for our medics' launch fuel, because my civilization also has plumbing at the bottom of its spectrum, and that is where the Combine's dignity currently lives. And the hull? Okoye asked. The master had the galley's best seat, which was the one with its back to the bulkhead heater, and she had not visibly slept, and her mug was her 30th year service mug from a freight line that no longer existed. And she looked, Nia thought, like a woman doing inventory of an afternoon and finding the count honest. Surveyed and stable. Hold settled, frames stressed but sound brain. Kavi made a gesture they'd all learned by now. The flat-palmed Irvet signed for a thing beyond recovery. The brain is a museum piece. The office is towing her to the brand yards for assessment. A pause, deliberate, the junior warden lining up a delivery. 9 hours on a band with this crew had taught her things no linguistics course. Covered. By the office is towing her, I mean the office has no tow capacity rated for the mass, and would like to engage a contractor. The galley was quiet for 1 second. Then Daz put his head down on the table next to his coffee and laughed until the bulkheads ticked. The knuckleboom towed the deep furrow into the brand yards 8 days later, slowly, in the manner of tugs, with the rigging surveyed 3 times over and the bill drafted in advance, because Okoye believed in payment terms the way other people believed in gravity. It was by tonnage the largest tow in the history of human contracting in the system, and the trade journals of 2 species ran the picture. The monster hull, scorched, scarred, holed at number 3, riding dead and docile at the end of the cables behind a 40-year-old tug 112, 100th her mass. Some editor on the ring captioned it in Irvit script, and the caption translated so cleanly that Callaway's dispatch office had it printed and framed inside the month. The corridor does not care whose channel the trouble arrives on. The inquiry, there was an inquiry, there is always an inquiry. The trade regards inquiries the way it regards weather and lawyers, as conditions to be dressed for, convened on the ring itself, in a corridor office annex with a long window that looked out by design or by someone's sense of theater over Sector 12's water gardens. It took testimony for 6 days. It heard the Combine explain its telemetry architecture, and the Spur Squadron explain its mesh doctrine, and the Office of Correction explain, with a candor that retired 2 careers, exactly how a precision lance shot had cracked a casting and opened a hold. It heard Vorlan read the timestamps into the record himself, refusing the offered summary, every frozen minute of them, in a voice like a man counting his own pulse. And on the 4th day it heard the tug. They asked Okoye why she had launched without clearance, and the master looked at the panel, 7 senior Irvate in the gray of office, and behind them the window, and behind the window the gardens, full of people walking around alive in the afternoon light, and gave the answer that ended up stenciled, eventually and unofficially, on more dock walls than anyone ever counted. Because the squawk reached somebody who moves when machinery says help. It wasn't aimed at us. It didn't need to be. Distress doesn't have an address, honored panel. It has a radius, and we were inside it, and we were the ones with the engine hot. They asked Nia about the boarding. She had prepared, in the medic's bay and the long tow days after, for the questions she'd have asked herself. The unauthorized schematics, the invented procedures, the irreversible purge rigged on her own authority, while 2 species worth of expertise watched helplessly down a light-lagged channel. The panel asked none of it. The panel's questions when they came had a different shape entirely, the shape of an institution circling the thing it actually could not understand. Engineer Varga, at the moment you boarded, the combined resources of this office had failed 3 times, each failure compounding. You possessed a fraction of our information, none of our authority, and a crew of 5. The eldest panelist leaned forward, amber eyes steady. What did you have that we did not? Nia thought about it honestly, because the day deserved honesty, and the answer she found was the one she'd been standing on since she was 18 years old, and a chief had first handed her a torque wrench and a list. Callus's honored panel, she said. You build beautiful systems and you trust them, and 400 years of your corridor says you're mostly right to. But systems are what you use when things go the way things usually go. When the machinery stops listening, what's left is whoever has spent their whole life touching it. You didn't lack ships or brains or courage. You lacked people whose hands knew the weight of a seized valve, Because you built a civilization good enough that nobody important ever has to turn. 1. She paused and decided the whole truth was the only respectful version. We're not anybody important. That's the entire trick. There's no version of this where you briefed us, because there's no version where anyone thought of us at all, until the cheap end of the spectrum was suddenly the only thing between your ring and 2 million tons. The people nobody briefs are most of who actually catches things. Honored panel. In every system, yours just found out. The transcript records that the panel was silent for 9 seconds, which in the proceedings of the corridor office is a geological event. The findings when they published ran 400 pages, and the trade read exactly none of them except the recommendations, which is also tradition. The recommendations were 5. 1. The Combine would refit all 9 VUN-class hulls with independent fire-isolated telemetry, real telemetry, sensor-fed, incapable of mailing anyone a frozen snapshot, and with externally accessible manual yaw and feed stage rigs, designed to be worked by suited hands under thrust. The design consultancy for those rigs was put to competitive tender, and the tender was won, to the surprise of no one who had read the incident record and the outrage of several firms with marble lobbies, by Callaway Transfer and Tau, whose entire design department was a tugmaster, an engineer, a convalescing rigger with strong opinions about handhold spacing and a kitchen table. 2. The Office of Correction would develop a boarding under thrust doctrine. The draft doctrine's first line was contributed, at the panel's own invitation, by Tugmaster R. Okoye and Reed. Send people who have done hard things with their hands, and listen to them on the way in. 3. Every warden of the corridor office, beginning with the most senior, would complete a working rotation in a licensed yard, not observing, the recommendation specified, but turning. The first intake reported to Meridian Yard within the quarter, and the sight of senior Irvet traffic officials in borrowed coveralls being taught gasket discipline by human apprentices entered the corridor's permanent stock of cherished images. 4. The matter of spectrum. The clause was short, dry, numbered, and to Nia's ear it sang. The legacy maintenance bands shared by historical allocation between Combine drone telemetry and human contractor operations. Band 6, the cheap end, the plumber's frequency, the wrong channel that had been so catastrophically, providentially right, would not be reassigned, repartitioned, or cleaned up. It would be formalized. Every automated hull in the corridor would carry the band in its distress cascade by law, on the reasoning the panel stated in a single sentence that Doc Walls also eventually acquired. A distress allocation is not a question of whose ears are intended, but of whose boots are nearest. 5. The office issued an apology. Vorland kept his word about the drafting. It named the hours of the denial. It named the cost of each countermeasure. It named the tug and the crew, one by one, correctly spelled. It contained no passive constructions of the type that had armored every official statement Nia had ever read in 2 languages, and its final line did indeed survive translation, arriving in English with all its weight aboard. We said there was no emergency. There was. You were already moving, thank you. The bill was its own story, and the trade told it longer than the rescue. Callaway's invoice went to the Combine, as law and custom required, and it was a masterpiece of the genre. 1 main engine, run to destruction beyond economical rebuild. 1 heavy rig suit, scrapped. 1 rigger's leg, surgical schedule attached. Consumables, cable, line gun charges, hose, fittings, crew hazard time at the contract multiplier, and at the bottom, in the box Okoye had filled in herself with 30 years of freight yard penmanship. Towing services, runaway hull as performed, standard rate. No premium. The standard rate for the largest and most impossible tow ever taken in the system, because the master's position, stated once and never elaborated, was that the day had been the job and the job had a rate, and the rate was the point. People who moved when the squawk came did not move for a premium. Anything else made rescue a market. The Combine paid it in full and fast, having developed, that season, a keen institutional allergy to appearing in feeds beside the word delay. That should have been the end of it. Then the ring found out the size of the number. Nobody ever traced who leaked the invoice, though Nia had her suspicions and they had amber eyes. What the feeds ran was the arithmetic, the total cost, engine and suit and leg and labor, of stopping 2 million tons 26 kilometers short of 11.4 million people, divided by 11.4 million people. The figure came out to less than anyone on the ring spent on a morning cup of anything. The transfer started the same day. Small ones, deliberately, ceremonially small, the price of a cup, sent person by person to a contractor's receiving account that had never in its existence held more than 2 months of operating margin. The first day there were 9,000. The day the schools took it up as a civics exercise, there were 400,000. Callaway's one-person accounts office, a formidable woman named Prue, who had survived 3 decades of freight line bankruptcies unsurprised by anything, called Okoye on the working band with a tremor in her voice, and announced that the account had stopped accepting deposits because the deposit ledger's daily index had overflowed, a failure mode the bank confirmed had never once occurred in the corridor's financial history. Each transfer carried the standard 9-character memo field. Most of the ring used it the same way. The phrase they chose translated a few different ways, depending on the linguist. Heard anyway was the common rendering. Also answered unasked. Also, in the version Nia liked best and kept to herself the one closest to the trade's own grammar. Not your call, it was. Okoye let the total stand for 1 week, then did the only thing anyone who knew her expected. She put every credit of it past the original invoice into a trust, and the trust found the thing the corridor had never had and now could not. Imagine itself without a standing rescue retainer for the working hulls of Band 6, so that the next time a tug or a trawler or a barge dropped its contracts and burned hard at someone else's catastrophe, the wages and the engines and the legs came out of the ring's own pocketed gratitude, automatically, no invoice required. The trade called it the Cup Fund after the arithmetic. The office, with the solemnity of its kind, gazetted it as the Corridor Mutual Response Reserve. The trade went on calling it the Cup Fund. Hask walked again the spring, walked, then climbed, then passed his rig recertification out of pure spite at the surgeon who had used the word retirement in his hearing, and took up his new unofficial post as the most decorated instructor in the history of Meridian Yard's apprentice program, which now ran bilingual. He told the story exactly as promised in every dockside establishment between the ring and the belt, and in his version Nia did do it one-handed, and in her version he did fall down a ladder he'd been told twice to clip onto, and both versions were bought drinks on the strength of being a matched set. Timo's apprenticeship ended 4 months early, by examination, the panel of examiners noting in the record that the candidate had logged more live traffic emergency board time than the rest of his certification, class combined. He signed full crew on the knuckleboom the same afternoon. He still hummed when he thought his mic was cold. Nobody ever told him. Ulith Kavi was not promoted, which scandalized the feeds until she explained, in a rare interview, that she had declined 3 offers, because promotion at the corridor office meant the supervisor's walk, and the supervisor's walk was where you stood when you had stopped touching the table. She stayed at the pool's rim. The office, adapting itself around her the way institutions do around their immovable objects, invented a title that had never existed and would never need to be filled twice, Warden of the Open Bands. Her sole standing instruction, written by herself and approved by Vorlon with what witnesses described as something dangerously near a smile, was 1 line. Anything that arrives on the cheap end of the spectrum gets believed first and audited after. And Nia Varga got offers. Of course she did. The Combine's drone division wanted her at 3 times her wage to teach their designers how machinery feels at the moment it starts to fail. The office wanted her as inaugural inspector of the new manual rig standard. A shipyard on the far side of the planet wanted her name on a consulting letterhead and was honest enough to admit the name was most of the job. She read every offer and she thought about them honestly. In the engineer's saddle, between the gauge banks of a 40-year-old tug with a brand new main engine that she had specified, commissioned, and broken in herself, and which sang. She said no to all of them and stayed, and if anyone needed the why of it, she had it down to 1 sentence by midsummer, polished smooth by use. The offers were for jobs where she'd be briefed, and she had seen what the briefed people were worth on the day the machinery stopped listening, and she preferred to stay valuable. The Deep Furrow flew again in the autumn. They rebuilt her at the Bran yards over 2 seasons, new brain, triple redundant, and fire-islanded, new vanes, new number 3 hold. And along her 1.5 kilometers of spine, gleaming at intervals like rivets on a boot, the new manual rigs to the Callaway standard, every gate wheel turning sweet at 1 hand's pressure, every catwalk webbed with handholds at spacings dictated by a convalescent rigger who had reviewed the drawings from a hospital bed with a red pen and no mercy. The Combine, in an unprecedented fit of institutional humility, petitioned the registry to rename her. The registry, in a more impressive fit of the same, refused. The name Deep Furrow stayed on the books with a single annotation appended, visible to every controller who would ever ring her transponder for the rest of her service life. This hull was stopped. Her recommissioning tow, the short ceremonial pull from the yard gantries to the freight lane, dead stick, the last time she would ever ride a cable, was contracted by the Combine's specific and publicly worded request to a certain 40-year-old orbital heavy tug. The fee was the standard rate. It was a clear, bright morning over Bran when they brought her out, and half the corridor's traffic found a reason to be loitering on the margins of the lane to watch. The monster and the tug, the pair from the famous picture, hooked nose to tail in the sunlight with the ring a thin, bright thread far below. On the Deep Furrow's hull, just aft of Maintenance Trunk 3, the yard crews had left their own unauthorized annotation, stenciled in safety yellow in 2 scripts beside the hatch that a human breaker bar had opened at the worst hour of the corridor's century. The Irvet script read, in the formal register, "Here entered the ones who answered." The English underneath was shorter, because the yard's human apprentices had been given the space and the paint and the trade's sense of proportion all at once. It read, "Trade entrance." Nia rode the tow in the engineer's saddle, gauges green, new engine singing, and listened to the working band. Dispatch grumbling about gantry fees, the fuel barge pilot humming, a crane operator complaining, with the contentment of a man whose elbow had years left in it, about his elbow. Somewhere beneath it all, on the same cheap spectrum, the corridor's automated tonnage went about its blind, patient business, every hull of it now carrying Band 6 in its distress cascade, every one of them wired by law to the one address in the universe that had never once needed to be asked. Shift change came as they cleared the lane markers and cast off the monster to her own cold thrusters, gentle as a hand letting go of a glass. Timo had the watch. Okoye signed the tow complete. From the galley came the sound of Hask, aboard as supercargo on the thin pretext of inspecting his handholds in service, losing an argument with the kettle. Nia hung her helmet on its hook, took the mug Daz handed back to her without either of them needing a word, and settled into the saddle's worn cradle as Meridian Yard came up on the boards, home and ordinary, and lit like a kitchen window. The tea, for once in her working life, was today's. On the bulkhead by the ladder head, the cheap speaker with the blown low end hissed its familiar idle hiss, carrying the small, dull weather of working lives, ready to carry whatever arrived next. In this trade, you didn't have to be asked. You had to be listening. They kept the channel open.